This is a kind of a current question. Is do you have a loudness goal in mind when you're mixing?
I actually do. I just got the TC Electronics Clarity M meter, which has been helping this kind of in real time see it in front of me. Um, but I have actually talked to my mastering guy Dale Becker about this a ton because he gets so many things that are mixed at like -6 LUFS, and it's just way too loud. And I'll get rough mixes at that. And I've been really, really shooting for a -9, -10 kind of peak LUFS, and I haven't had any non-approvals for any loudness issue. So I guess I must be doing something right, re-injecting dynamics into the mix. So I think -9, anything below that gets a little hairy when it translates to Spotify, just because competition-wise with people that are super dense in the high end, like I don't mix very dense in the high end. I think I mix with enough high end to compete, but more dense in the music, in the low mid and low end frequencies. Mostly low mid, so we can get like chord value in music, and I think that impacts the LUFS a lot. So -9, -10, lowest probably. On a bad day, probably -8 if I really have to compete with a rough mix that I think has vibe really locked into it. And I'll probably go. I don't think any higher than -8 in the past couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. But I'd like to start out by asking you about, your childhood growing up. I mean, were you from a musical family? Was music an important part of your life? I mean, how did you interact with music as a kid?
It's really funny. I have a friend staying with me from New York right now, and about an hour ago, he actually asked me while I was setting up the microphone for this, are you from a musical family? And I would say I'm from a musical family in the sense that they're gigantic fans of music. I mean, my mother played violin when she was a kid, and my dad played the accordion when he was a kid, but neither of them went on to pursue it. My brothers both played instruments when they were younger, but neither went to fully pursue it. My older brother still plays drums, I guess, as a hobbyist. But I think I was kind of the odd one out, but always supported in music by parents. I kind of wish that I was told to play the piano as a kid, though, versus picking a horn or wind instrument. I think the piano would be a little bit more important to my career trajectory at the moment. So I only can dabble on that. But I wound up picking up the saxophone early on and finding a pretty deep love and connection for Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, and the jazz greats of the 60s, which was kind of my favorite decade of music, I would say, in a lot of ways. But I think I might be the odd one out that pursued music. Yeah.
What was your first experience with recording? Was this on your own, or were you somebody else recording you, or what?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. When it was time to go to decide if I was going to go to school for, I guess, what direction in music I would go to, I was auditioning for, the bigger conservatories, of their time, and I had to record audition tapes, and my family didn't necessarily have the budget to put me in a studio to record them. So my dad thought it would be really interesting if he purchased me an affordable Korg digital 16-track recorder. I don't remember the exact brand of it, but it was a digital 16-track Korg. And it had basics. It had knobs that were compressor knobs, and it sounded terrible. But it got my head around the idea of multi-tracking. So what I would do would be find instrumental chord changes that were already kind of royalty-free recorded, and then I would find the progressions that I was down with, and then solo saxophone over it. And then I kind of stumbled upon the effects section, which was really cool. So I started putting random delays and reverbs and choruses on my saxophone. I was like, I've never heard a saxophone sound like that before. And just start messing with it and thought it was cool, but never thought too much of it that I wanted it to be a career at all. Then wound up at the Hart School of Music at the University of Hartford in Connecticut, studying, oddly enough, classical saxophone, which seems an oxymoron at this point in my life, and studying music education because I thought I would be a conductor or an educator of some sort because I was really inspired by my high school band director, and I thought I could maybe give back to kids that way. And then in order to survive at school, I got a work-study job, which wound up being in the recording studio of the school, which would record all of the classical and jazz performances in the 4 halls that existed, and we would edit them together to release on CD and on their website, which was fascinating to me. It was my first time I saw Pro Tools, and I started cutting things up and manipulating audio in seemingly unique ways to me at the time, and thought, oh wow, I should do this for a living, and called my parents and brought it up to them, and obviously they were not a fan of me dropping out of school. And after a really long conversation over, I think it was like a holiday break, they allowed me to do that, and then the story continues with me setting up a recording studio. But that's probably for a different part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. For me, when I started out, there was no entry level. There was only Ampex and big consoles, or not even consoles at that point. So
yeah,
there's a lot more opportunity these days for people to get their foot in the door at a really minimal cost.
Yeah. I remember that recorder probably cost only at the time it felt like a lot of money to me. But I think it was like $400 or $500, and you could, with very low quality, you can at least capture something and manipulate it, which I think is the most important part of what we do. I mean, there's a lot of purity involved to the capture of audio, but that's not always the job. A lot of the times it's how you manipulate it and how you make it current and modern sounding, which is, kind of where that knowledge comes into play. Like the first thing I didn't, for the first time I recorded, it was not make this sound as good as possible. It was like, I know this can't sound that good, so let's just get the job done and figure out how to make it sound the best possible that I could get it.
Right, yeah. Well, back when I started out, it was all, what could you do with the tape?
You got to go in there with an X-Acto knife and start editing parts out.
Yep. And running at different speeds and running it backwards and splicing stuff together different ways.
Actually making a real flange effect.
Real flange effect with 2 tape machines. That's
with
right.
2 tape machines. Now I can pull up a not a fab filter, the Valhalla Uber mod, and there's 18 great flanger presets all within 2 seconds of each other.
That's right.
Oh,
yeah,
man.
It's a lot different world.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, okay, I think that pretty much answers how you got into recording.
I mean, it goes a little deeper, but I'm not sure how where, if there's another question that would ask this. But I did wind up getting a internship right away at one of the bigger studios on Long Island, where I'm from. That my mom had a friend that linked us. So I did get into a studio with SSL and Neve consoles very quickly after that. So was able to understand the recording studio atmosphere at a pretty young age. I think I got really lucky with that. I was taken under the wing of the owner of the studio. It was Cove City Sound Studios, and the owner of the studio was Richie Kanata, who was the saxophone player of Billy Joel at the time. And he, I guess, took a liking to me because I was also a saxophone player. But out of the 3 or 4 interns that were there, for some reason, he never asked me to take out the garbage or go pick up food for anybody. He was always like, you should go in the room. You should just sit behind whoever the engineer was for the day. Don't ask too many questions, if any. Keep your mouth shut, but you should sit in there. I think he maybe saw something in me and always wanted me in the room, which was, I mean, now looking back, like that was an unparalleled luck. To have the ability to watch people mix and record records every day at such an early age.
That's a great opportunity, really.
Yeah.
In recording, there's so many different aspects of it. I mean, people that aren't involved in it don't really realize that there's a whole palette of skills you need to do this well. So I'm thinking just a few of them will be, the recording process, miking, mixing, producing, being the psychologist in the room with the artist. How do you feel about those different aspects of it? Do you have a favorite of those, or one you really don't like doing?
I like them all. I like them all in different capacities. I'll start with recording. I love recording live music in a space that sounds good. So, and with good players. So I do not like recording just a vocalist over an instrumental track. That happens very regularly in the pop music scene that I am in. I will do that if I am producing the song and it needs to be done, but that is not where I think my forte lies. But setting up a few mics and capturing a space and a performance in a space is one of my biggest passions. So selecting mics for that purpose, I've recently, as you know and we've discussed prior, I'm very much into using ribbon mics and tube preamps, which I have very many of, thanks to the likes of you and your team. But I do really love that. It just doesn't seem to be where I exist mostly. I was actually thinking about it today as I was setting up this microphone for this purpose. I haven't really set up a microphone to record in a few months. Granted, I had a pretty severe injury occur where I was down for a bit, but then post that, I've been mixing for 2 months straight, like every day, and which I'm so thankful for. But the psychologist in the room part is actually probably my favorite, because I really love dissecting and getting to the nitty-gritty into where people's intentions are really coming from. And they seem to be comfortable enough around me to, at some point in the session, let that out. So that to me is the biggest privilege of what I get to do, and the most impactful, because if done well, you'll get the best out of the artist in that circumstance and in that session. So hopefully it'll translate to the world and to the listeners. So that's my favorite part, because I struggle with what we do as audio engineers and producers that actually impact the world more than just, making music, which I know isn't as simple as just, it's just making music. But it's hard to feel purposeful when your job is so replaceable in a lot of ways, because there's thousands of, especially in Los Angeles, there are, hundreds and thousands of people that have talent that if you're not available for the gig will get the gig and do it adequately, if not more than adequately. So where I think that the purpose is found is, helping the artist really translate their thoughts and their emotions into a product that will stand the test of time. And that's the most important role, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer, John. I like that. Well, moving on to a completely different topic. When you start a project from scratch, do you envision the final product in your mind and then just keep working towards that goal? Or do you let it evolve? Or, is it just dependent on the situation?
It is dependent on the situation, but I talk about this pretty regularly because intention seems to be the most distinguishing part of being a professional, I think. The ability to understand reference points and the intention of the artist and have the ability to, within a certain amount of time, because deadline dependent, you might not have a lot of time, get it over the finish line at the highest quality possible. So I have to give a little credit to the PMC speaker team because I have recently upgraded my speakers to this MB3 active model. And the thing that I keep saying when people ask how I feel about these speakers is that they get me to my end goal much faster. So the investment in that listening environment is making me realize the intention of the artist, then realize my own intention and getting it done pretty quickly. So I think that I probably would say that 90% of the time I hear where I want it to be before I touch it. And part of that experience is listening to it, say in Apple AirPods, and walking around my block for the first 3 or 4 listens of the song to really understand what it's like in the real world before hearing it on such a hi-fi reference system. This way, I can kind of understand how the other people are going to digest it and get it there. So,
when you're producing something, I'm sure you have a wide variety of different artist personalities you deal with, because you deal with some pretty big name people. But can you give us a sense of how much you envision the final product with things that the artist might not be familiar with or comfortable with initially, and how you get around convincing them? And I'm sure some of them have very strong ideas, and it's hard to do. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to ask. Also, taking a step back from that, the caliber of artists that I work with on a production sense and in the room with them has not been as high as it is, and I mean clout-wise, not necessarily ability-wise, as much as it has been on the mixing side of things. So the few production cuts that I've gotten with bigger named artists, I have not really been in the room with during those circumstances. So I'm coming in as a producer more on a finishing touch, I guess, position on the team in those circumstances. But that doesn't mean that doesn't translate to mix moves with the artist in the room, and especially having demoitis, which is a real thing, and struggling to, because you don't want to convince someone that your idea is better than theirs, because that's obviously very subjective. But if you have any sort of emotional capacity and empathy towards the artist's product, which arguably we should be only working on things that we feel that sort of connection to, or at least 80% of the time, but that's another conversation that I could bring up. I think that if you have that connection, you'll be able to understand the intention, and they'll feel that too. So you're on the same team at that point, and you want the best for the product. So I tend to wind up seeing eye to eye with people, and I'm also only going to pick and choose certain arguments and fights to attempt to win. Like a snare up is not a fight that I'm willing to fight for if it's not distracting from the vocal and the emotion of the song. So if they really feel like they need to contribute by asking for a snare drum up mix, I'm most likely going to allow that to slide. If that snare up mix takes away from the impact and rhythm of the vocal, I'm going to explain to them that in the way I'm just doing now, which is it's getting in the way of the vocal, so maybe we should lower the snare so it doesn't take over the vocal place. And that's usually an easy win. If you start saying you're wrong or hitting them with more definitive language into why their decision is like maybe dumb or not correct, or however you want to phrase it, it's just semantics at that point. I think that can run you down a dark hole, and then they will probably never hire you again. So you have to be malleable, and and go with the flow, but also know that you're the hired professional and quote unquote expert in the room. So that's a tough balance. It is a tough balance.
That's a psychologist again.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The demoitis part is tough because with things as loud as they're being given to mixers this day and age, when you start unwrapping the amount of limiting and ableton distortion without a limiter on and peaking, it starts really showcasing imbalances in the mix that were hidden by whatever limiting and distortion was happening. So you're unveiling problems that if you have the rough mix on you at all times, you can A/B the balance. That's a kind of a secret that I think that not everybody does, which is constantly referenced. So you're still giving the artist and the producer the balance that they were striving for, but doing it in more of a proper way with dynamics, and then all of a sudden you can start seeing the deeper parts of the picture. And I think there are tools to get the balances and loudness back that need to be studied and practiced.
When you're setting up for a mix, whether it's your own project from scratch or something you're handed, do you have a process, a set way of going about setting that up, exploring it, and figuring it out?
Yeah. Well, first off, I have 2 assistants that do the prepping part. So ideally, and it happens most of the time, sometimes it's just not on them for how loud something was, and I don't want them to recreate it. But ideally, the session, whether it's stems or a Pro Tools session delivered to us, comes back sounding exactly like the last listened to rough mix. And when I say listened to, I mean by the A&R, by the manager, by the artist, by the producer, by the sister, by the brother, by the mom, dad, everybody involved that said, yes, this is the magic, this is the one. Let's get Jon to just take it that last 5% and finish it off. So when Josh or Ingmar, are setting this up, I'm coming in at that place. Every once in a while I go, guys, I don't actually care about that rough mix. I don't think that rough mix sounds good. So just kind of put the stems in, get my template in, get it colored, and make it look nice for me. I'm just going to mix it, which I would say is few and far between because people have their vibe injected into their rough mix most of the time. And at the level I'm working at, it's by great producers. So there's no need to really recreate it. But every once in a while, I get to have a lot of fun and kind of do a faders down mix of it. But the process involved starts there, and as that's happening, I'm probably walking around, going to grab an espresso and listening on my AirPods to that rough mix and really understanding the intention of the producer and artist.
Yeah, and this is a very broad question. I don't think there's a specific answer. I'm just more interested in your thoughts on this. There's times when your process has to be fixing things, and there's other times when it's enhancing things. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Part of my 80-20 rule is that, and I think this just shifted in the past 2-3 years, where you spend the early parts of your career working on 80% things that you need to do for survival and probably 20% of things that you feel passionately about and really putting your whole into. And now I've kind of flipped it, and it feels really good, to be honest. And I'm working on 80% of things that I really, 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 really feel passionately about, and 20% are kind of, I should probably take that gig for whatever reason. So in that 80%, there's a lot less fixing because the producers are at a similar place in their careers, and the artist is too. And, besides random clicks and pops on bad edits, there's less fixing. But very specifically, I would say that the biggest culprit for having to fix is the bad vocal recording. It's pretty consistent. I would say it's more than 50% of the time the vocal does not sound what would have been acceptable in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe up to the 80s, 90s, requirements for a passing vocal sound. It's so there's a lot of fixing there. But what I do, and I have something that kind of involves you and your creations and how to fix this, is where I wind up doing pretty bold reduction EQs in whether it be boominess from bad mic placement or harshness in cheap capsule sound on a microphone that, you're on a budget and you have to get your ideas down in your bedroom and the fire alarm's going off and you don't know how to, get rid of the fire alarm. You could just replace the batteries, but that's a thing. But I do really broad reductions in harsh harmonic frequencies, and then I recreate that area pretty broadly with the Hazelrigg VLC1 that is your mastermind creation as well. It really rebuilds the even order harmonics of sounds after doing big reductions. So I remember doing something, I think it was on Macklemore's vocal. It was recorded really, really bright, and Ben really likes his vocal bright, but and that's fine. But I want to do it in a bit of a more tolerable way. So I actually remember taking a linear phase FabFilter Pro Q and doing a reduction from 6 or 7K shelf down like maybe 20 dB, like pretty substantial dip, and then taking the high boost on the VLC1 and cranking it. And it was a remake-up of the information that was there, just in a better way. And I thought, wow, this is kind of magical that you can replace harmonics with a better version of those same harmonics with a box that has the precision and, audiophile clarity, that your tube gear has. So that's really influenced my ability to fix and feel confident in not saying, hey guys, you need to re-record that vocal, because that's never going to go over well, because for two reasons. One, the song might be coming out tomorrow. Two, the vibe is there and you're never going to get that performance back again. So that's the only time I'm really, really fixing. Another example would be out of phase kicks and 808s. Or just out-of-phase drums in general. It's the first thing I look for before I even pull out an EQ or a saturation tool or anything. I look, are the kicks in phase? Are the snares in phase? It's my first thing I actually do in a mix in general, I think, almost every time.
When, speaking of vocals that you have to do some repair work on, are you getting things that have come in already with processing on them, or are people mostly sending you stuff that's just the dry vocal?
It's a combination, but I would say when I get the wet or the processed and the dry separate, the process is usually so much further than the raw vocal that there's literally no way I could remake the vibe on the raw vocal, that I just wind up using the processed one, because I'll never get the mix across the line if I start from scratch on it, because they did ridiculous amounts of waves, R compressor, whatever people do with that plugin, and R Vox and all that stuff that I really don't mess with at all. I'm not gonna be able to recreate it, so I just use the processed a lot of the time, especially if it's a really loud, dense pop or R&B track. If it's a more dynamic, organic track, I will always use the raw vocal and, do my own thing to it. But when things are dense and already kind of caked in with vibe, I just kind of use the processed. And when possible, though, I will not use a processed affected vocal with their reverb and delay, unless it's a deadline issue where they're like, this is all we got an acapella and it's coming out in a day, so this is what you got, which is very rare that occurs.
All right. Well, changing direction here a little bit, I'm curious to know, you're relatively young, but still there's been a lot of technology changes, I'm sure, throughout your career. And how do you see that as changing the way you work?
That's a great question. I was very fortunate to spend 5 years being mentored by Tony Maserati. And Tony, the best at staying current. He is always keeping younger engineers around him that show him the most current tool to use. He'll decide if and how he wants to use it, and he might use it in a completely different way than an 18-year-old Ableton producer is using it, but he'll still use the tool. And he showed me that in order to stay current, you have to know what the youngest music makers are using. And where we both kind of agree past that is understanding certain standards and respecting the gear and art that existed before this new technology. So he has a hybrid system where he's part analog and part digital, and it's all dependent on the song that calls for being in the box or out of the box, or using a hardware compressor on the vocal, or just using a plugin. What's the turnaround time? Is the artist going to be in the room? Is it going to be attended with the producer? How, there's so many variables involved into when to use which workflow. But if you're working on 7 songs in a day, and I don't mean you're mixing 7 songs in a day, I mean you're doing tweaks on a few, maybe mixing 2 songs in a day, recording a vocal on 1, and you have this recall ability to just do it in the box with the newest technology possible, and it be there saved so it sounds exactly the same the next day when you go listen to it to try to work on it again. I don't think anybody can argue with that flexibility. So, and this day and age, the converters are so great, and microphones are great. I don't see any issue adapting with the times. That being said, I think that calling yourself a mix engineer and not knowing the difference between an attack and release on a Pro C2 from FabFilter versus an 1176 classic model compressor, I don't really stand for that. I think you should understand both sets of tools if you want to actually call yourself a professional mix engineer. So I think that's where Tony and I saw eye to eye, and had a respect. And then in turn he decided to coach me and train me because of that. There's a story of the first time I ever really worked with him on a mix. Was a Lady Gaga song called "Marry the Night" that the vocal was recorded on a tour bus and sounded terrible. There was nothing above 5K and a hum from the tour bus at 60 hertz, and he was working on it and getting really, really frustrated, and he wound up kind of getting really frustrated. I'm going out to smoke a cigarette, like, you fucking fix this, or whatever he said. And I remember he had just gotten a retro state level compressor in the rack that morning, installed by his assistant. And I was like, oh, I've never seen that before. Let's see what that does. And he had it on an insert, I think 26 or 16. I forget which number it was at the time. And I remember putting it on and then turning the input knob all the way up till the needle was pinned, and it was oversaturating and distorting and kind of faked those upper harmonics that didn't exist. And then he came in the room and he's like, oh, what did you do? And he looked at the needle and he saw the needle pumping. And he was like, huh, that's cool. I don't think I'd ever do that. And, and that vocal, I don't think he did much more to it. And it wound up kind of being the sound of that vocal. And that was a kind of respect thing where, that was an intense, bold move on that piece of gear that was done by a kid that had never seen a piece of gear. But if I was using a plugin, I would have just turned the knob up all the way. That's kind of what I do anyway. I kind of just try to break things apart and then put them back together. But sometimes visually in a plugin, if you're breaking something apart and putting it back together, you have this visual thing in your mind like, oh, why am I boosting something so high or overdriving something so much? But when you have a knob to turn and you're not looking at a screen the entire time, you wind up doing more bold moves. So I think there is a hybrid thought process to the two, and I'm kind of still working that out. Actually, daily. I was talking about this yesterday with a friend, because the visual element of modern music making can definitely mess with your psyche, and if you're going too far on something, even though it's just a GUI, it has nothing to do with anything. So yeah.
That's an interesting point because even back in the days when I started recording with, big analog consoles and tape machines, multi-track tape machines, I always found watching the meters was distracting me from the music, from listening. And I find that's even more so now when you have a GUI in front of you with all kinds of stuff going on, all kinds of things you can play with. And I just wonder if you find the same thing, that sometimes all that visual information just gets in the way of listening to what's going on.
Yep, I actually have a trick where I have a hot corner for a screensaver that has a visualizer that after I make almost any move, I put the screensaver on and I don't look at Pro Tools. Almost every move. It gets a little obsessive, to be honest, but no one's ever complained, so I'm going to keep doing it. Actually, on Halloween 2 nights ago, I was playing old Hitchcock movies on my TV and on my computer screen. And I thought, that would be kind of cool, like playing a black and white Hitchcock film instead, or some other visual stimulant that has nothing to do with music or with metering, with anything, because it is so distracting. Like, say you're doing a fade and you're doing it digitally in the box and you're staring at that fade. Your brain is already biased towards if that fade is correct just by the way the slant looks. But the slant has nothing to do with how the fade is actually reacting in Pro Tools. So that's one example. I mean, if you're doing an 8-bar loop and you're looping a section and it's the same section, but just because you duplicated it, you might think there's something different about the groove in the second time, even though it's actually duplicating just the same exact thing. There's so many psychological twists that occur by looking, but at the same time, I would never forfeit the ability to edit syllables and bad recording and bad edits and drums on the grid and phasing without seeing it on Pro Tools. Like, I don't want to go back to the 60s and have to record on tape. Like, I just don't. To me, that's completely irrelevant. Even to, unless you're doing a whole project that is of the time, on that medium for the sole purpose of it being that, I would totally down to do that. But for anything modern, that sounds like a big headache.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was most of my career, and I don't want to go back to that. I really don't.
That's funny.
We have tools now that are so much better, and it's just, our lives are so much simpler. There's no undo button on a tape machine. If you make a mistake, it's done. There's no way to get it back. So
yeah, I mean, there's people my age and younger, and they're going to listen to this and be really mad at you for saying that, and me, because they want to go back to the legacy days and go to Capitol Studios and use a tape machine, and like, that's cool. But put that stuff into Pro Tools like really quick so you can see if your drums are out of phase, because you're going to keep boosting 60 hertz on a kick out mic, but all you have to do is flip the phase on the kick out mic and you had your 60 hertz. And by doing that, you're occupying so much space that is fighting against loudness by boosting all that low-end information that is going to make your vocals sound compressed at the mix bus stage. Like, these are things that nobody, I don't want to say nobody, that is way too bold, but that a lot of people don't think about when they're asking for the vocal up. It's like, well, how much low-end information do you want? And our job is to get those balances right, and part of recording on a modern medium is to be able to see those problems and get us there quicker. So,
yeah, no, I agree completely. But what I run into, and maybe you can give some advice to people that are just getting started in this. I run into people who focus on the visual aspect of the music rather than listening to it, to the extent that to them that they practically don't even need the monitors turned on. And that's just so bizarre to me. And I think you give a good example of why that's not really a good approach.
That's really funny. I was just asked about my feelings on the Surfer EQ. I forget who makes this EQ, but as I think it is a very smart invention, and I have demoed it, and I probably will get it and use it. I have a hard time with this algorithmic assessment of frequencies. For example, I heard that someone uses it on an 808 bass drum, where for every peak, it reduces the peak accordingly. And in correspondence to the key, you insert the key, and then as the bass notes move up, the reduction point changes in effect. And where my head and heart goes with that is, why are you perfectly reducing those overtones? Music was made with 808s and kick drums for so long without that I think that makes the unrefined sound of an 808 have its authenticity and its agitation and energy. That if you're taking out all of its upper harmonics or quote unquote bad harmonics, the way it interacts with the punchy kick drum on top of it is going to change. The way it reacts with a piano or a sample is going to change and make it sound a bit too pure. So I think that is that's a really specific example of a more broad issue that I'm having with these kind of smart EQ scenarios, where I think the reason you hire a craftsman mix engineer to work on your song is to leave in some of the mystery and the mysterious frequencies that are quote unquote bad harmonics, because that's what gives intensity and tension and release and all the things that make music human, rather than sterilized, maybe background music, experiential dancing. I don't know where to go with that exactly, but there is a lot of sterile music being made purely with the way you're speaking of, where it's mostly visual, if not fully visual. And I'm trying to, remain an artisan and trust my gut and my emotional reaction to the music.
Yeah, well,
but using modern tools.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, for me, I'll always go with the imperfect performance if it has the feel. And I think a lot of people are just obsessed with getting everything perfect. And if you go back to a lot of those classic records that we all love and listen to the individual tracks, there's a lot of bad stuff going on there that just doesn't really matter.
I know the PMCs don't lie. You can hear all the faults in a lot of early music that, oh wow, they left that. And those things kind of jump out at me on these speakers, and those are really conversational moments. You're like, oh wow, that's something I don't hear in micromanaged pop music these days, and I think there's a want for that. There's a starvation for that imperfection in still produced and tight, concise pop songs and arrangements. I just think we're lacking that, and I think these new modern tools are taking us a step away from that feel, or some of the tools that I'm talking about with those smart EQs, because the performance factor is kind of the same thing. You need imperfections in performance and capture of sound in order for it to sound and feel real.
Getting back to the recording studio, when you're doing a project from scratch or even just doing overdubs on it, how do you go about choosing the mics? I mean, what do you look for? And I know you and I are both, fans of ribbon mics. I mean, I've done sessions where a lot of them really that it's just all ribbon mics. But tell me about how you go about choosing the mics you want to use.
Yeah, the last 2 years I think have been exclusively ribbon mics at my new studio, the Gift Shop in downtown LA. We have this beautiful wood hanger ceiling, and I do have two DPA Omni condenser mics that are, really fantastic at miking space for sure. They are up, but other than that, it's usually exclusively ribbon mics, and maybe on a vocal I'll use my C12. But I've been using AA, R44, and R88s on almost everything, and KU4, and they're pretty much their entire arsenal. I'm super into. I really am looking for going back to the early days of recording, where the design of the equipment was done in order to capture the purity of the sound source. Having the ability in the box to manipulate to our heart's content, I want to have the closest to the true sound source possible. And then most likely those sounds will not remain as pure, but I have all the harmonic content of it to mess around with. And I think that's the opposite of what people are doing today. We're like, I just want to record with some vibe, and I want it to, like a bunch of pedals and a bunch of whatever, and capture the sound as is, which is also great, and really having the ability and the confidence to commit to tones right away is really great. But I'm just taking a different approach, and I think it's my own approach, and I don't think it's better or worse than that. But I love using digital tools in the box to manipulate really great recorded material.
Well, that's one thing I've always said, that if you don't capture it right, you're already at a disadvantage, and using the right mic and the right preamp can make your life so much easier.
So much easier. I try to tell my friends that all the time, because I'm at a unique stage in the mix process with like a lot of different producer friends, and they ask me, what did you have to do to this vocal? And every once in a while I go, man, not that much. Put my VLC on it, put a little 1176 compressor on it, or a Fairchild, UAD, little reduction with Pro Q2, like really simple things. And the other times I have to go, man, it was a lot of work. I think it would behoove you to invest in a great mic, vocal chain, and then start going into why I love ribbon mics and why I love tube preamps. And I can go into that briefly now. I think condenser mics were created while recording to tape, because you were getting at the time of tape recording, because you were getting a lot of that saturation and tape compression that was dulling up that. So you wanted dulling up the high end. So you wanted that condenser sound to cut through. But now that we're already in digital mediums with these high-end converters, we don't really need a condenser mic to cut through. We can just boost top end, on a ribbon mic. So you're getting that fast transient ribbon response. The only issue though is if you put up a ribbon mic right next to a U47 or a C12 or a Sony C800, it's most likely not going to compete in its raw form. So you have to do more work to it. But that's okay, because you get a compressor, you get an EQ and a preamp that you like, and you set that setting so it makes up for that excitement energy that you're missing from the Sony C800, but just with a beautiful Pultec passive EQ sound, right? And it's competing, but it's more realistic, and it's faster, and it's crisper, and it doesn't fatigue you when you turn it up, but it still sounds pop and exciting. So I think it's a step. There's one extra step to get it there, but you have more flexibility after the fact using ribbon mics and tube preamps versus solid state.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to me that something like the 44, designed in 1930, which was the best quality microphone available at the time, just far outshone anything else that was available at that time, is still a totally viable and wonderful microphone even today.
Oh, it's incredible. I use it all the time.
Yeah, me too.
All the time. I use it as a mono drum room down by my kick, about 3 feet out, and I don't have to add a kick sample 3 feet away, and it sounds punchy. Granted, my room is kind of Motown tight and small, but I don't ever put a kick drum mic on, and that's the only mic, and the kick sounds punchy. It's great.
On another front, there are some people that are utilizing DSD recording these days, and I wonder if you have any experience with that and what your thoughts are on that.
I don't, but I don't have experience personally. I do know that George and Joff Hazelrigg and you are big advocates for it. Therefore, it makes me take it very seriously as a potential medium. But I haven't really found a practical usage of it in my workflow. I have listened to A/B demos of things recorded simultaneously to two different mediums, and the DSD is remarkably better and more emotional. But I don't have personal experience doing it, so I don't know how to fit it into my workflow just yet, if necessarily ever, unless I was doing a live performance. I'm not really too prolific at this.
Yeah, Joff and George will convert you at some point, I'm sure.
They will. I think I need to experience it with them.
Yeah.
I think I need to go into it with someone, like someone's training me almost on how to use this and how to care about this and how to implement it. I know there was talks about having Tascam sending me out a unit at some point to try, like four circumstances where, like, I have flown out George and we've recorded out here on things with a band, and for those things, it would be cool to have and to try it, and then just flying those files into Pro Tools. But then you're not staying at DSD format once you're importing to Pro Tools, but you are capturing it that way. So that could probably be injected into my workflow in some way.
Yeah, I think from my experience with it, it's sort of, maybe not as dramatic, but it's sort of like that initial capture with just the right ribbon microphone and just the right mic preamp, and how that just makes your job so much easier down the road. I think DSD capture just conveys the emotion of the music so much better. It's kind of remarkable to me.
Yeah, it felt that way when they sent me an A/B to listen to. I think you guys were all involved, and it was the same exact recording at the same time. And there was a stereo mix that was just DSD. Then there was like a multi-tracked version through another medium, and it was unreal. The DSD version. I mean, it was so much more immersive. So the other one was, it was Radar. I think it was Radar versus DSD, and it was way more immersive and gorgeous sounding.
Yeah, that was recorded here. I'm using the same Radar to record our discussion.
Awesome.
I'm not recording at DSD because I don't think that's really necessary for this project.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah. Any thoughts on where you might be 5 to 10 years from now? I mean, what are your career goals, and what do what would you like to have happen in your life?
Wow, Doug, that's a deep question. I think about it daily. I'm not one to plan for the future, which, as I'm entering my 30s, I'm 32 at the moment. I think I'm supposed to think about those things more. Career-wise, I want to be, I guess, what would be referred to in this industry as an A-list mix engineer. And that is very difficult because there is already a group of A-list mix engineers that are fantastic at what they do, that I highly respect. I'm just getting a little bit exhausted of the same sound occupying the top of the charts in music, whether it be top 40 R&B or alternative and indie. It seems to be a similar gamut of mixers. So I'd like to enter that within the next 5 years. I think I am very close to it. I'm sharing record credits with these people, and I have a bunch of my own as well. But I think I'd like to be a bit of a more go-to, trusting mixer that has a slightly different approach to what I would refer to as the second wave group of engineers. And again, I say that with much respect for their success and their craft as well. I just think there's some new perspective needed in this field, and I think I have it.
Is there anything that you want to talk about that we didn't cover that you feel is important?
I do. The one thing I wanted to bring up, and it's we didn't really get into, which I didn't want to do, get into like kind of geeky technical things. But I wanted to talk a bit more about an approach that I have that I think is different when it comes to mixing. And I know we did talk about process earlier on, but a pretty specific thing, which I also want your feedback on, because you're a big part of it, is my affinity and infatuation with saturation, and why that is the go-to tool for me, rather than a compressor, limiter, or an EQ right off the bat. And I mean all different kinds of saturation. I don't mean using the same box for everything. Granted, as the listeners might not know, I have a DW Fearn VT7 on my mix bus at all times. I believe it's 100% of the last mixes in the past like 2 years, or a year and a half, or whenever I got it from you. But that already is doing a nice saturation thing. But in the box, we have so many profound tools for modern and vintage saturation, and I think where a lot of modern music lacks is its musical content. I think we all know how to make drums hit hard and vocals to sound overcompressed and high energy and exciting, but where I find a lot of mixes lack, and I don't know if it's bad monitoring or laziness, not caring about chords, but the chords are always lacking to me, and not only to me, it's to other, peers and collaborators that I work with. I'm always kind of trying to balance, if you think visually about the left and the right hand of a piano player, the right hand being melody most of the time, and the left hand being the foundational chordal music and bass notes, and kind of bringing that left hand up. The right hand is really easy to keep up in the foreground. But at the same time, not getting rid of impact. So saturation is my friend in that, and I do it in all certain ways. I'll use exciters, and I'll do different style modeling of saturation. And most people ask me what compressors I use and what EQs I use, and I don't have a good answer for that. I always struggle to answer what compressor I use on whether it be vocals or whatever. I'm kind of like exhausted by compressors. I mean, we have clip gain in Pro Tools to level out vocals. Compressors should be used as any other effect. They should be used as an effect. If recorded properly, you can balance a vocal without using one heavy-handedly, unless that's what you're going for, and you're going for like a rock and roll, like punk, exciting fucking vocal thing, But the use of saturation is coming into the conversation more, and it's funny because like that was probably all that was happening in early days of recording. You were pushing tubes, you were pushing tape, and you got that desired glowing sound, which was known as saturation. And that's what we were talking earlier about needles moving and meters moving and how distracting it is. Like, you wanted to pin a console, you wanted to pin a tape machine because you wanted that transformer saturation, you wanted the tape saturation, you wanted tubes to peak. And I always think about a tube this way, and I could be wrong, so please chime in here. But when I think about a transistor and I think about a solid state circuit, I see this tiny little piece of metal with a transistor on it, and the sound has to go squeezed through that. So you can only maybe get a certain size sound out of that. But when you have a tube, the tube is glowing and it's expanding, and as it's getting hit harder, it blossoms, and seemingly the sound is getting bigger and bigger. It's very, very obvious on a DI bass, on like a VT1 or a VLC1. And it just seems to get bigger and bigger. So when I have the VT7 on my mix bus, if a client's like, and this is actually really rare because I mix bass drums really loud, but hey, can you turn the kick up? I don't feel less confident in the ability to turn that up, even if I have my gain staging right, because I know that it's just going to hit that wall a little harder, and it might squeeze a bit, but it's going to still be punchy and big because of saturation. There's a bit of a safety net going on. And I think that's, there are certain saturation plugins and boxes that will stunt transients, but we also have modern tools that are transient shapers that you can rebuild transients post-saturation. So if I were to divulge any secret that like I said earlier to you when we first got on the call, I don't really believe in secrets. This would be the only one that I think is really worthy of sharing, which is don't be afraid to oversaturate things, but make sure you make up for transient loss after it, especially with plug-in saturators. So I just want to kind of shift people's brains on looking for the best compressor, limiter, and EQ before thinking about how balanced the harmonics are. And we have a lot of new tools. Isotope, for example, is, oh man, they're killing it right now with saturation and with, dynamic EQs and things that are a little bit more modern. And I think that's where my head's at, where I'm sure, the second wave dudes are getting into that, but I don't notice it as much. I don't notice the chords, evoking the emotional intention that the piano player had on a lot of modern mixes. I just hear drums and vocal. And I love drums and I love vocal, but also love music. So I'm trying to figure out how to balance all of it in a fresh way.
Yeah, good point. And, if you look back in the history of recorded music, you had stuff going way back even before tape, where things were recorded to disc, and that was 10-20% distortion on that stuff.
Right.
But it sounds great. I mean, and I think it's because it's mostly even order harmonic distortion and not the raucous kind of distortion that you run into with a solid state overload.
Yep.
You really need tubes to do that. And even the optical soundtracks of old movies, it's very restricted in dynamic range, frequency response, real high distortion, but they sound great. If you don't analyze it for its technical quality, but just your emotional reaction to it, they really captured sound great back then. And you look at the 45s from the 50s that were, you could turn the volume down and just hear the stylus on the turntable making enough noise that you could listen to the music. You could hear it. Those things were just so overdriven, and it's just a sound that just grabs your attention. You can be in a store and it comes on the store speaker, and it's just like you got to stop and listen to it. It's just compelling. So I think you're onto something there, because that is, connects with some human emotion somehow.
Yeah, there's the word that comes to mind is there's a tangibility factor to it. Like you can reach in and touch the instrument, and you can put yourself in the room, having that dynamic range. It might sound crunchy. I don't even want to say crunchy because you can still do it cleanly. I think you crunch when necessary, but the records you're talking about are crunchy and actually audibly distorted. And then I think that the newer way of doing that is to inject just enough, having plugins that have wet, dry, knobs and sliders on them. I'm, only adding maybe 10-20% of that affected signal. So it's there, and it's, psychologically, like you feel it, you could hear it, you kind of hear it, something's different, but it's not the foreground of the sound, and you blend in these subtle amounts of that on certain instruments. Like, okay, maybe you'll leave the kick drum really clean and the 808 really clean in the low end, so the low end sounds expansive and deep, but you're putting you're saturating upper harmonics in the piano, so you can reduce the lower mids in the piano to get out of the way of the bass, but you're injecting, like, without an EQ, a subtle amount of that harmonic distortion, even order harmonics, as you mentioned, into the mid-range of the piano. So that stacks up nice, and you can stack your instrumentation and your arrangement without aggressively boosting EQ. It's really hard to be nuanced about the language here because it's such a feel-based thing, which is what they were doing on those old 45s you were talking about, and it's very difficult to put into words. But I think I'm just onto something, and I wanted to express it here and let people kind of ponder this idea, and maybe we could elaborate on this another time when I'm a little bit more down that road, because I think it's very important as dynamic range increases. I remember I have a playlist with my one of my mentors and great friends, Spider, who it was exclusively 60s music from Africa. And if you put it on a great pair of speakers, first of all, it sounds great, but it's quiet, right? You have to turn the volume knob up a little bit. But on the iPhone, on small devices, everybody's like, oh, you got to mix for the iPhone. You got to mix for small devices. That's how the majority of humans are consuming music, which is 100% true and very important. Those records sound bigger on iPhones than super squashed -6 to -7 LUFS mixes on iPhones, because there's no transients. The transients are all sucked out, so it doesn't jump out of the phone at you. So when I send a mix back at -9, -10, it sounds huge on an iPhone and still competes on Spotify. So this loudness war thing just needs to go away. I think we would do really well with it just being gone. And we're on the road there with the normalization of streaming services, which is another whole conversation, but really exciting. But if you saturate and bring up the harmonic content and then recreate transients and limit less, I think music's going to start pulling at those heartstrings again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. That's really good points.
I don't necessarily want to mix like somebody else, and I think a lot of young mixers are in their stage of their career where they are emulating, and I definitely did that for so many years, probably for the majority of the time. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But Tony, while training me, saw something unique and never wanted me to kind of just ghost mix for him and stay there. He always wanted me to have my own sound, which I can thank him for now, which I have, probably like the other night when I saw him. But at the time I was like, man, I kind of could use you like giving me gigs, you know what I'm saying? Like, trying to survive in Los Angeles. But him pushing me kind of out into doing my own thing, I think I need to honor his intention there by doing something unique. And I think that this is a sound that I'm trying to create, that within a few years people will want that sound. And for example, I was able to do that on my most recent release for Khalid's most recent EP, which I mixed with my friend Dennis Koziak, where Khalid wanted kind of smoother R&B lush mixes, and I was able to kind of inject that kind of fuzzy saturation sound while keeping it, like I said earlier, bright and poppy and competitive, but leaning more on the warm side. And for an artist of his level and reach in the marketplace, that I'm kind of hoping that people want that sound. And as I get more clients and artists of that caliber, I'd love to inject a bit of that influence into music moving forward.
When I talk to young people coming up, because I'm asked to speak at some of the recording schools and other places like that, and I always encourage people to develop your individual sound, because if you just sound like everybody else, what's the point?
What's the point?
Yeah,
they're gonna go to that guy. They're just gonna go to that guy. He's gonna do it better than you because that's his.
That's right. So you definitely have to develop your own style. And if I listen to the recordings I did, I hate to say this, but 50 years ago, and compare them to things I'm doing today, some things have changed. Like the equipment's changed, and the caliber of the people I'm working with has changed. Mm-hmm. But the sound that I had back then is not all that different from the sound I strive for today.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, I developed that style then, and I just haven't found anything that fits me better. And I think that's an important point to make to people coming up is that, what you have to sell is your unique ability.
100%. It's there's nothing more important than acknowledging that. And if you are lucky enough to have a mentor that can tell you that, or you're not lucky enough to have that experience where we have YouTube and we have the interwebs in general to seek out knowledge like you just dropped on us. So find that whatever validation you need to find in order to be the best version of you in every aspect of life. But we're talking specifically, audio related in this portion of the interview, but in all aspects of life, just if you're you, man, you're going to get resonated with in some way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
true.
I really, really like that you just said that. That's kind of how I think on a daily basis.
Great. I remember what my point was when we were talking about loudness. And, I'm reminded that the loudness wars began the day the limiter was invented in the 1930s. And it's not a new thing. We have tools for making stuff just painfully loud now that we never had before. But the concept has been around forever. And that, on the one hand, is discouraging because we haven't learned anything in 80 years of having that tool available in one form or another. But the normalization of loudness in the streaming services, I think, is going to put an end to that. And people are going to they're going to find that their overly compressed mixes sound tiny. And when they mix to a level that's compatible with the services recommendations, then things sound great.
Yeah, that is a great point. I've actually never thought about that. I'm going to probably spend the rest of the day thinking about what you just said. But I'll add that we're not mixing for SoundCloud MP3 quality audio anymore. We're mixing in perpetuity as bandwidth, internet bandwidth gets faster and faster. We already are streaming 4K video on Netflix. At some point, we're most likely going to stream lossless quality audio on all services. I mean, Tidal's doing it, and Tidal sounds fantastic, but we're not mixing for radio anymore. Radio is determined, yes, still by labels paying radio to play songs, but by what's streaming really well. So these standards are changing, where I think the loudness and dynamics and everything that we have to offer as engineers is going to be really shining. So if your mixes are compressed and tiny, you're going to know it, versus on the radio, you don't know it. On SoundCloud, you don't know it. And on Spotify, you're starting to know it, but you don't really know it. So sooner than later, there's going to be a big gap in people that actually can mix records and people that are going to have to kind of go study a little bit more and learn what a limiter actually does.
Yeah, and good point, too, about who we're mixing for, because, why does MP3 even exist anymore? The bandwidth is available to basically anybody to stream stuff in real high resolution.
Doug, I don't know. I don't know.
Well. Yeah. Well, this.
I think we missed it. I think we missed wherever Netflix picked up. I think they actually don't really know. I don't want to talk anymore on it because I don't know. I'm not an expert at this. Yeah. I don't know why we have MP3s. We shouldn't have MP3s.
Right. I want to ask the questions that hopefully haven't really been explored enough yet.
Yeah.
And dig into these people's psyche a little bit and just figure out what makes them do what they do and how they got there and everything. Because, so many interviews, I better stop the tape now.
No, keep going.
So many interviews are just sort of a recitation of projects they did and what mic they used and what processing they used. Yeah, and what plug-in. And I hope you agree with me that all that stuff's really irrelevant.
Completely.
The core thing is what makes you do what you do, and what are you aiming for, and how do you get there, not what tool you used.
It's not about any tool. I mean, I always tell that I tell friends and my two apprentices too. Like, if you put Tony in a room or you put me in a room and only gave us one compressor plug-in and one EQ, we can still make a record sound more than listenable. It doesn't matter what those tools are.
Yep, I agree.
I'm not sure it would be as good as if I had more tools, but it would be very much a listenable, balanced, energetic record.
Yep.
So I think those tools are irrelevant. They're preferred but not required, I would say.
Right. Okay, John, I think we're both worn out from thinking.
Agreed.
So thanks so much for doing this. I think it was I learned a lot about you that I didn't know.
That's awesome. I would wonder, though, on a totally different note, I would wonder that if you were ever, I'm talking to my manager about this, and I'm also going to be doing it more next year. I'm trying to figure out how to start going to schools and doing some kind of lecturing. I already kind of talked to Berkeley and trying to talk to people at NYU at Clive Davis, and like, I don't know if there's ever a way that we could kind of do this live, like, and pretty much the exact same thing. Maybe we can.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
Like, doing it together as two different generations of music makers that just kind of exist on a stage in a large format conversation style thing would be kind of interesting.
Okay.
All right,
John. Thank you so much.
What a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And
cool.
I'll be talking to you. I'll send you this when it's done, and we'll be talking probably in between. But if not, I'll see you in person in Anaheim.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.